All right, hi everyone. I'm Jocelyn Wong. I'm with BALLE, and I'm gonna kind of start off with some housekeeping for the webinar today. If you're logged in, the bottom of your screen you should see some menu controls. There is a chat icon, which is kind of like a word bubble. If you click that icon, you should see the chat box that pops up to the right of your screen. You'll be able to enter comments in here if you wish throughout the webinar. And then there's also another icon on that bottom bar. There's a box with a Q icon in that, and that's a Q&A. That's a Q&A feature that Zoom has. So you can enter questions into that. If that's not working for you, you can enter your question into the chat box. We'll be tracking questions throughout the webinar, and then at the end of this session, we'll have a question and answer kind of discussion section where Laura and Tim can start answering your questions. Yeah, so I guess we'll just jump in here. I'm Jocelyn Wong. I'm with BALLE. That stands for the Business Alliance of Local Living Economies. We're a network organization, and we work in Canada and the US with community leaders that are trying to create different approaches to the dominant economic system. Pushing for an economy that transitions from an extractive accumulation of wealth and centralization economic model to a system that redistributes wealth and democratizes power and shifts economic control to marginalized communities. That's a little blurb. And then myself, and also Yvonne Yen Liu is here on the call. Both of us are from BALLE, so we will be helping kind of manage the chat box for questions, as well as the question and answer questions that you have. And then I'm gonna pass now to our speakers, Laura Zabel and Tim Lampkin. Go ahead, Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Zabel. I'm the Executive Director of Springboard for the Arts, which is based in Minnesota, both in the Twin Cities, in the urban area, and in Fergus Falls, which is a more rural community in west central Minnesota. We work here locally in the middle of the polar vortex, and also nationally by sharing models and tools. And I'm also a current BALLE Fellow, so I'm really happy to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Lampkin. I am the CEO of Higher Purpose Co. We are a nonprofit social impact agency based in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I am also a BALLE Fellow and excited to be a part of the work we're doing and share the work we're doing today. Our work really focuses on building community wealth and focusing on communities of color, particularly here in Mississippi, supporting the ownership of businesses, land, and homes.
Thanks. Yeah, so I actually forgot to mention this is our webinar on bringing art and culture into your local economy work. And so to kick us off on that, Laura will be giving a little bit of a presentation discussion here, and then we'll jump to Tim for his section, and then we'll have a conversation together. So Laura, do you want to go for it?
I will take it away. Before I share my slides, I also wanted to mention that Jocelyn also didn't mention that she's also an artist. And I think that part of what we want to talk about today is how we bring all those parts of ourselves and our creativity into the work. So I'm super excited to be able to work on this with BALLE and especially with Jocelyn and Tim. All right, I have some slides to share with y'all, so I'm gonna work on that little technical thing really quickly here. Here we go. All right, so the framing that I want to talk about today is this idea that at Springboard that we call creative people power, and really thinking about that as a natural resource for local economy and local community development and organizing work. Like I said, Springboard's based in Minnesota. We talk about ourselves as an economic and community development organization that's run by and for artists. So we have a staff of 18 practicing artists that do this work, and our work is really all about building reciprocal relationships between artists and their communities, both supporting artists' ability to make a living and a life, and really seeing artists as entrepreneurs and small business owners and people who have a lot of value to provide to their communities, and making programs that help communities and non-arts specific organizations, neighborhood organizers, community clinics, other community anchors and institutions connect with artists and think creatively about their work. There are kind of these two big foundational ideas in our work, and the first is that we really define art as being about meaning making and meaning making in everyday life. So that's a really broad definition of what art is, and also a really broad definition of who artists are and who gets to call themselves an artist. So that includes people who went to school for art, all different disciplines of art, writers, performers, musicians, visual artists, but also includes people who are culture bearers and tradition bearers, people who have creative practice of their own, anything from people who sing in church choir to people who do museum shows. Our work really tries to hold space for all different kinds of creativity, and to really think about creativity as this idea of being connected to how we make meaning of our lives and with each other. The other idea that really is foundational for our work is that community is made by doing things together, and that creativity is a big part of how we come together as communities, how we bridge difference, but also how we build solidarity with people that we want to build power and agency with. I admit I switched this picture out today just to give you guys a little glimpse of Minnesota for those of you who are calling in from warm places. This is actually a dance performance in the middle of a lake in Fergus Falls, Frozen Lake. So when we think about what role can art play in local economies or in this local economy work, I think it's important to sort of start the conversation not at the sort of most transactional piece of like number of businesses started, or I can tell you all kinds of reasons why arts-based businesses are good for local economies. They're built to stay local, they're built in cultural practice and provide other things for community. But I think it's important to start a little bit farther back in the conversation about why we care about locally based economies, and start with this idea that fundamentally the desire to live in a healthy community is pretty universal. Maybe one of the last universal ideas that exists, that most people would say they want to live in a healthy community and in a more healthy community. And actually, a lot of us have a pretty similar definition of what a healthy community can and should look like in terms of the way it serves us. But I think, at least broadly, most of us can also agree that a lot of our communities don't feel healthy and aren't serving everyone equally or equitably. And particularly right now, we have these really big changes like climate change, systemic racism, lack of economic opportunity, the need for urban-rural solidarity. And those are big systemic changes that are going to require huge culture change, huge human behavior change. And so I think it stands to reason, and I think most people sort of get the idea that what got us into this mess essentially is not going to get us out. Sort of replicating the processes and the tools that we've used in the past is not going to be our way forward to building healthy communities for everybody, or healthy economies that serve everybody. Particularly in the realm of traditional community and economic development, which I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here at BALLE, but I think it bears saying that the sort of traditional economic development approach that treats a community or economy like a machine with parts that can be optimized and has this sort of top-down deficit-based or even service-based approach is not going to get us where we want to go, and that we need to think creatively and think differently about how to move forward. So this is one path forward, or one resource that we think exists that is kind of an undertapped or underutilized resource, which is the idea that we can combine a sort of basic practice of community organizing and the idea that people are the agents of change, and that part of what's necessary for change to happen is to build both individual power, collective power, and then the pathways of influence. That's sort of a basic, I'm sure a lot of you know, that kind of basic community organizing philosophy, that you can combine that with a sort of basic idea that creativity, that new thinking can drive community change. So we, stands to reason we can come up with new solutions if we ask different questions, if we try new things, if we take a more iterative approach that comes from art and culture and creativity. And the way Springboard thinks about it is that we combine those two ideas into this idea called creative people power. And I think it's helpful to kind of use a metaphor to think about creative people power as a renewable energy source that is like a natural resource that exists in every community. Every neighborhood, every block has creative people. Every community has creative people. So it's a natural resource we already have access to in every place. It's not something you have to import from someplace else. But it also requires infrastructure. So just like solar energy, you can live in a very sunny place but not have access to solar energy unless someone builds the solar panels. So a lot of what we think about in our work at Springboard and the work that we're trying to support in other places is how to build that infrastructure that allows people to both tap into that creative people power and also tend to that natural resource and make sure that it's healthy and accessible in their community. I think it's helpful to share maybe just a couple stories of what that can look like when your community has access to creative people power, when there are these pathways to plug in to the creative community and the creative thinking in your place. So this is an example from our urban office. This is a huge light rail construction that happened in St. Paul. This construction went right through a number of neighborhoods in St. Paul that had very real historic reasons to be worried about displacement and worried about who this construction, this new infrastructure was going to serve, and also right through the heart of a business district with a really high concentration of first and second generation immigrant-owned business and other businesses owned by people of color. And so this construction disruption is incredibly challenging for small businesses. Looking at how creative people power can help, we trained 600 artists who were from and of these neighborhoods, so they knew the neighborhoods really well already and understood the needs and the cultures that were present, and then supported those artists to do about 250 small projects that were partnerships between neighborhood groups and neighborhood small businesses. They were projects that literally reanimated vacant space, brought people together in new ways, built social connection and relationships in the neighborhood, attract people and attention and dollars to local businesses, and really try and change the narrative of these places, both around the construction narrative and how hard it was to visit these places during construction, but also generally the narrative about the value and the assets that exist in these neighborhoods already. An example from our office in Fergus Falls, which is a more rural community, a very similar scale challenge, but a very different challenge. This is a historic state mental hospital. It's about 750,000 square feet, the whole campus of vacant space in a community of 13,000 people. I could talk about this project all day, but I'll just say in kind of broad strokes that this is a really contentious issue, remains a contentious issue in Fergus Falls. And we started literally this simply with a chalkboard designed by a wonderful artist who's now on our staff named Naomi Schliessman. And I think this is a good example of how artists can help ask a different question. So rather than asking, should we tear it down or should we not tear it down, or even asking, what do we do with this building? We started by asking, what else is possible? And from that small project, artists have designed over the last many years all kinds of different projects that engage people in coming onto the campus, connecting with the building in new ways, projects that have, I think, really opened up pathways for the community to have a deeper and more profound conversation about the role that mental health treatment has played in their culture, which is, I think, when we talk about economic development, one of those things we often try and skip over is the kind of human process of sharing joy and pain and shame, and really exploring how economies have impacted the culture that exists in a place. This was also a project that happened in a vacant storefront downtown, so these projects can work on a lot of different levels in terms of animating space as well as making space for community voice and community stories. We've also done a number of projects in Fergus Falls that really exemplify how art can kind of be the glue that brings a whole bunch of different sectors together around new ideas in a community. This is a launch of a project that we did that was a partnership between the Public Health Agency, the Department of Natural Resources, the Fergus Falls Public Schools, and was supported by the Minnesota Super Bowl host committee to design a play sculpture at the trailhead of a bike path that was really designed to make sure that the community, and particularly the young people in the community, saw themselves in the eventual design of that sculpture, and that it created a kind of focusing agent that made sure people knew that bike path was there, could access it, and understand it as an asset in their community. All of these things in both urban and rural settings, I think one of the most important outcomes from tapping into creative people power is the way that it can change the narrative, and both the external narrative that other people believe about your community, but I think more importantly, the narrative for people who are already in that community, giving people a sense that change is possible, that there's a place for them to make change, and a sense of optimism about the future, and a sense of where they can plug in and make a difference, I think is one of the most important things that creativity and art and culture can lend to movements around community change and local economies. So that's some of what I think the outcome or the impact is from creative people power. And so this last year we did a research study with Helicon Collaborative to help us kind of unpack what are the ingredients, what are the principles if you want to generate creative people power. So if you want those kind of results, how do you get there? And we came up with this pretty simple approach that is based on our approach, but also the work of a lot of other people across the country that are doing really important community-centered work around arts and culture and building power and agency in their places. So I think there's three key principles: that this work has to be reciprocal. It's about building real relationships and being in a relationship with your community, not sort of parachuting in or a sort of developer-led investment strategy. I think the work has to be asset-based, really builds from the things that are already in place, which I think also makes it more efficient. It's a nice side benefit. And this work needs to be equity-driven, beyond just saying that projects or narratives need to serve everyone equally. I think the work needs to address systemic inequity, particularly around race and gender and geography. And then there are these kind of four necessary elements that we think are part of how you build that infrastructure to tend to your creative people power. A really important idea, and you'll hear more about this, I think, from Tim also, is this idea of hubs and homes, that projects are great, but there have to be places where people know they can get connected, where people can drop in with ideas, get connected to other folks in their community, and really get access to resources or other people to get something going. We really believe in a theory of lots of little, that creating on-ramps and lots of ways that people can participate is a super important place to start, rather than trying to start with one iconic project that needs to speak for everyone. Find ways to bring artists to the table, really thinking about how to create intentional roles for artists in cross-sector conversations is an important part of supporting this work. And then I think almost the most important thing you can do is to really figure out, how are you tending to your creative community? How are you extending the resources that maybe you already provide for small business owners and other local economy leaders to the artists in your community, really helping support their ability to make a living and a life. It's a particularly important equity issue that we are making it a viable career and life path for artists of color, Indigenous artists, and artists in rural communities. We have some resources to help with that. We have a workbook that's a business skills program for individual artists. This is available for free on our website. We also have healthcare resources for artists. We have a very large healthcare program. We have a national partnership with Kiva that helps artists access capital, both through the Kiva platform and through matching funds and other technical assistance. We also have a project that's available as a toolkit called Community Supported Art, that's based on the Community Supported Agriculture model, but instead of vegetables, you work with local artists so people can find and collect local art and meet local makers in their community. That's a project that's been replicated and adapted in about 60 different communities across the country. It looks different at everyone. Super, super joyful to see that happen. We also run these other kinds of mechanisms that help people connect directly to artists, including a roster we call Ready Go, that's projects that are artist designed and purpose built for building power and agency, building community participation and engagement, things like street corner letterpresses and a whole park and a trailer that can be a part of existing community events and existing community conversations. All of those projects I talked about today, plus a lot of other projects, are available on a website we call Creative Exchange. The URL is at the bottom of all these slides. And there are toolkits, free toolkits there around specific projects, but also toolkits for helping to find and work with artists in your local community. All those resources and profiles of artists working all across the country to kind of help get your juices flowing, help you think differently about the ways that you might connect with your local artists and bring them into your work and benefit from that idea of creative people power and really see creative people power as an asset and a resource in our collective work that's trying to build broad and equitable community health. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. That was great to hear all that. Yeah, and Tim, who's also done some work with Springboard, do you want to jump in here, Tim?
Yes, let me share my screen. All right, can you see it? All right, great. Thanks so much, Laura, for providing that amazing overview to what you do. And I'm always excited to listen with you. So I talked a little bit about earlier the kind of origin of our organization. We are locally based in Clarksdale, Mississippi, in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, very rural in terms of context. Our team is also from this place, which I think is super important when you're talking about doing community development and community engagement work. We have a diversity in terms of our background, mostly in business and community engagement. But what's interesting, our creative director is an artist. So thinking about how we engage with artists is very essential and part of the culture of our organization. So in thinking about how we can work more broadly with artists, I reached out to Laura and to engage in a very wonderful conversation. And we talked about how we could do a project together, particularly focusing on artists of color here in the Mississippi Delta area that have been overlooked and underserved. So we created the Delta Creative Business Challenge. And in theory, we started with this idea of working with artists over a period of time to really focus on not just their art, but also how to monetize their gift. And so it feeds directly into our mission, which I mentioned earlier, is to build wealth in communities of color across Mississippi by supporting the ownership of land, businesses, and homes. And this particular project, some of the objectives for this project was really to highlight creative entrepreneurs of color, address the lack of racial equity in the tourism sector, and utilize and increase the awareness of a local cultural space, develop a unique model to engage artists, and then create relationships with unlikely partners. So really plugging in on that thread of rural and urban partnerships, not necessarily leaning towards the negative narrative as it talks about like the rural and urban divide, but how do we work together collaboratively to use our strengths and our assets to really shape a different kind of narrative. So we did a 5-week program. It was 4 weeks of really intensive training and working with the creative artists on making sure that they understood various aspects of what they were trying to build, and even going as far as helping them understand, like, why do they create what they do, and what is their really true gift. And so we utilized the work of art curriculum to really have a solid foundation, thanks to Springboard for the Arts for allowing us to use the curriculum. But this entire project was really funded by the Collaborative Action Grant that was funded by the Enterprise Community Partners, which is essentially why we're able to provide this wonderful project to artists in our community. And this also was a partnership with the Center for Rural Strategies, who has a huge impact in doing work in rural places, but also telling the narratives of rural communities through the Daily Yonder. And so it was a really important asset for us to make sure that we included multiple partners that brought unique strengths to the table to really launch this project. Some of the things that we've learned in terms of working not just with artists, but just entrepreneurs of color in Mississippi is that there is this idea that there has to be someone else to come in and do the work, that has to be someone else that doesn't look like them, and particularly to create the change. And so part of the work that we do is we really bring heart and soul into the work, while also creating a space and a place to understand the needs, but also threading in, I would say, pockets and opportunities of empowerment to really show that they have everything that they need already in terms of the creativity and the willpower and perseverance. And so we couple that with really tangible resources in terms of training, workshops, as well as access to capital, which is a component of the work that we do, and it ultimately provides business support. So in talking with our participants, we that there was really a lack of understanding how we bring in the marketing components to supporting artists and businesses in general. So one of the things that we did was we offered, the next slide will show you here, we offered an opportunity for all of our participants and to really have individualized marketing to empower them. So this was another way that we said, you are artists, how can we help you? And we really went another step forward to really ensure that they had some tools to share within their network. In addition to that, all of our participants received professional headshots that they can use beyond the partnership in the project. And we also leveraged all of our social media, the website, and our newsletter to do promotion of the artists. And part of the social media piece was not necessarily to promote the competition and the project, was really to help the public see the artists as artists and really accept that we have amazing artists already here in a place like Clarksdale, which we know for the most part is known for its cultural tourism piece because of the impact of the creation of blues music. And so tying it all in was really helpful for us to really show that there's a lot of creativity that already exists. So I will end my little presentation here by showing you a short recap video of the community engagement piece that involved some of our partners, some of the other local organizations that we work with, friends and families of the artists that came out to actually be a part of the combination of the Delta Business Challenge.
Higher Purpose was started in 2016, and we started with the mission to build small businesses and help local entrepreneurs through trainings and workshops. So the last 2 years, we've really been thinking very intentionally about how we can enhance our programming and talking with Higher Purpose was started in 2016, and we started with the mission to build small businesses and help local entrepreneurs through trainings and workshops. So the last 2 years, we've really been thinking very intentionally about how we can enhance our programming and talking with the local entrepreneurs, our partners. And so today here in Clarksdale, Mississippi, we hosted the culmination of our Delta Creative Business Challenge. We've been working with 6 entrepreneurs here over the course of 4 weeks to train them on business plan, marketing, pricing, branding, you name it, to really help them elevate their business idea. Today, we had one of those individuals actually win the competition, and we hope to basically use this opportunity to expand this initiative throughout the Mississippi Delta to help more local entrepreneurs grow their businesses.
Great. So part of what you saw there was this community engagement piece where the artists also had the opportunity to set up a vendor's table to sell and promote their products that they made, that the services that they're offering. And the young man at the end that actually won the challenge is a local photographer that had been in business for quite some time, but through this particular project has increased his business, has been more confident and really honing in on his skill set and really understanding that he is an artist and really embracing that. And so it was really essential for us to highlight that part. But also, I mentioned earlier, the bringing in how we provide capital to support not only entrepreneurs, but also artists that want to create viable and sustainable businesses, and then coupling that with giving them access to our headquarters that provides a home and a hub for resources that they can come and get help with everything that they're working on.
Great, thanks so much, Tim. Great to hear from both of you. And wanted to talk a little bit about things around ownership about with these assets, and you know, sometimes artists, they might create content, they might be the ones to create material, but then, you know, part of the disempowerment with the economy is that they don't actually have ownership to anything. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit, but also I'm sure Tim has something to say about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the questions that people consistently ask, as well they should, is around, you know, there's a long history of artists being used in service of displacement or you know, to incent developer investment that leads to gentrification or to sort of create narratives that gloss over existing challenges or problems in a place. And so I think that's part of why our work has really focused on how we build power and agency first. And we think about the sort of outcome of an artistic project as not the outcome that I care about it. So it's disingenuous to say I don't care, but it's not the outcome that we care the most about. What we care about are the relationships that get created, the ways that people build individual and collective power by naming and claiming their identity as artists. I can give an example of a kind of mechanism we use that I think kind of directly addresses that challenge. We have an emergency relief fund at Springboard that both works for artists' individual emergencies, which are nearly 100% healthcare emergencies because artists really struggle with access to healthcare and health insurance. And a couple of years ago, we expanded that program to not just help artists who were experiencing personal emergencies, but to help artists respond to community emergencies. So the Community Emergency Relief Fund turns around a small amount of capital in about a day, usually, to help artists respond and organize other people in their neighborhoods and in their communities after there's been a community emergency or trauma, which could be a natural disaster or a human-made emergency like police shooting or after the Muslim ban last year. So we've had artists who are working with other people who are also from and of those communities and neighborhoods to create creative responses that bring people together, that help people build the relationships they need to build power together. We've had projects that specifically address gentrification and displacement come out of that, and projects that are more about community healing after trauma, or about pushing back and creating protest actions in those moments. I think that's the kind of thing where we're sort of taking the emphasis off art as an object or as a work of art at the end, and more about the process that art allows us to create together and the ways that it allows us to build together, both build power but also build ownership. And I think Tim's work really is important in terms of the way that it builds wealth very directly, but wealth that also leads to change in the narrative and in the culture, and ultimately builds power for people who are from and of his community already. You should talk about it though, Tim, not me.
You're doing a great job. Don't stop. Yeah, well, for us as an organization, I think the foundation of our work really started with this idea is that, how can we really address issues in our community, and using a kind of a solutions-based organizing approach versus being reactive. How can we be proactive in really addressing some of the solutions? And for us, it is about working with community, working in conjunction with our entrepreneurs, our artists, our farmers, to really support the work that they're doing, and figuring out how can we be flexible and nimble enough to really address those needs. Because I think that's the other aspect that goes into like the DNA of our organization, but also makes it very localized, is that we understand that, we can't necessarily, expect everything to go as way as planned, but particularly in a rural community, it's very unique in terms of the relationships and the different nuances that go into understanding how to create the best solution that is one effective, but also effective in using the minimum and lack of resources that we have because of where we are. And so part of what we've started to do is really, for us, not only shift the actual tangible way we talk about ownership, also thinking about owning the work and owning the place that we live, owning the place that we come from, and that being a tool of empowerment within itself, and then helping other people understand how they fit into this much larger idea of building wealth, not as a very tool to just continue to have wealth for the purposes of that, but really to create generational wealth, and that unlocks power and unlocks access to additional resources. For us, I believe that, particularly in this particular project that we did around supporting artists and creative entrepreneurs, it was more about the community as a whole, recognizing that there are artists of color that are productive, that are doing amazing things. Because when you understand the full context of our place, where we have, under 20,000 in terms of the city population in Clarksdale, but we also have the same amount of tourists or even more visit our town because of the cultural aspects. How many individual artists locally, particularly in a community that's 85% or more African American, how those artists of color really benefiting from the tourism that comes, the dollars that come into this place annually. And so I think that's the other piece when we talk about ownership, how important of that is to really not talk about it from this place of just from the monetary value, but really owning the stories, owning my creativity, owning my ability to create the solutions locally that are needed to serve my community, versus having this scarcity or lack of resources mindset that we're not enough. And I think providing that platform is part of the work we do. And then you add on the actual tangible, like, here's how you do it, here's the resources to do it, so that's, for us, that's where the work really sits in terms of ownership.
Great, thank you. Or do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I think everything Tim said is yes.
Simple answer. Cool. Well, I did want to leave some time for some question and answer. We do have some questions that have rolled in throughout the session thus far. Just to reiterate that for folks that may have missed it at the very beginning, there is the question and answer box. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there should be a little square with a Q, the Q&A. You can enter questions there. As well, there's the chat box, which you can enter questions in there as well. And just real quick, we can share the slides from this session, as well as this session is being recorded, so we'll be able to share out the recording for folks if you want to share that to people that may have missed it. There was a question that came in from Jad. I think you touched on it a little bit, but Jad was wondering if speak a little bit more on how artists can deepen equity and reciprocity, so not as to simplify beauty or de-escalate difficult conversations with their arts, and touched on it a little bit. I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, that starts with who gets to call themselves an artist and who we invite to do this work. So really starting from that place as you think about this work, and as you think about how artists come into local economy or organizing work, like Tim said, that focus of artists who are from and of the community already, who understand the issues and the opportunities and who have the relationships there already and understand the challenges that the community faces is, for me, the first way that you sort of guard against being complicit in some of those things. I think it is a process that focuses on relationships and on creating ownership, both actual ownership and wealth creation, but also the sense of ownership over, for example, public spaces. So really figuring out what are the creative ways that bring more people into the conversation, rather than deciding what that narrative is from the beginning or what the question is from the beginning. One of the reasons that we really advocate that lots of little approach is that it allows a lot of different perspectives and voices on a particular issue, and it sort of prevents the idea that we decide from the beginning what the narrative around this particular issue is. And I think the work that I talked a little bit about in Fergus Falls around the state mental hospital there, for me, is one of the biggest, that's I learned from that work so much about how we entered that thinking that was primarily a conversation about what to do with a very contentious vacant space. And the work over time really evolved, because of all of those community voices, to be much more centered around a community conversation around mental health treatment, the ongoing needs for mental health treatment in that community, and the ways that mental health treatment had impacted the culture of that community over the last 100 years. And that's the kind of thing that I think you don't get to that other question unless you start with a really open aperture and a mechanism that allows a lot of different people to come to the table, and people who have a lot of different opinions about or ideas about how to move their community forward and how to advocate for the change they want to see. So I think those are some of the, I think a lot of that has to do with where you start and how things get built. If you start from the perspective of letting a developer, or even sometimes your city, say, this is the narrative we're trying to create, or this is the problem we're trying to solve, then you're already kind of starting in a place where people can be either intentionally or unintentionally co-opted into that sort of the way we always work, rather than letting people come with new ideas, with new questions. So I could talk about that forever, but those are some ideas.
Great, thanks, Tim. Did you have any extra thoughts on that, or?
I mean, the only thing I would say in terms of like how do we really address kind of, you know, not trying to beautify the issues in our community is that I think one of the unique attributes of artists is that they're able to really shift our minds and our hearts without doing a lot of, you know, overthinking. The simplicity of their gift and their craft oftentimes is enough to cause people to have a conscious check in and really have those aha moments in terms of how they're particularly, you know, thinking about a particular issue in the community. I think the challenge there is that there has to be more organizations that are supporting those artists and either creating a platform or working in conjunction with them to really address some of those difficult issues. You know, for us here in Clarksdale, you know, the often narrative is about, you know, what we don't have. And I think understanding how artists fit into that, not just this one-time project, it's constantly at the top of our minds as an organization. And I think the challenge for us is how do we get other organizations that are doing traditional economic development or other aspects of, you know, community development, whether it's healthcare or affordable housing, name it, how do we get them to understand the value of engaging artists, not from, you know, from this, oh, let's add artists to this project and it makes it cute. No, it's like artists are also a part of this community. They're also very gifted and talented that bring a very unique skill set to really provide another layer of thinking as it relates to addressing some of those difficult issues.
Thanks. Kind of tails that into another question that's come up about how you've been engaging cultural anchors and supporting artists, and then also, you know, proposing this to a city or government groups, agencies, like a city council or something, or such. Or Tim, you could take that.
I can take it.
All right.
Oh.
So I, in terms of cultural anchors and cultural institutions, I think my answer is it depends. I want to be both optimistic that in the same way that the community and economic development sector is undergoing a change and trying to find new pathways, that both our sort of existing institutions in arts and culture are also undergoing that change and trying to find new pathways. And I also want to be realistic and transparent that for those of you who work really solidly in local economy work and maybe have fewer connections to artists or arts and culture in your community, that approaching your big cultural institution in your community might not be the best path to do this kind of work. Arts and cultural institutions, you know, are complicit and are part of the systems that impact systemic racism and inequity writ large in our communities, and have been a part of you know, and are just hooked into those systems of wealth inequality and access to wealth and ownership in all of the ways that other big institutions are, and can be super problematic. That being said, some of them are, particularly are really trying to imagine new futures and try new things. So I think it's a place to be cautiously optimistic in terms of working with those organizations. you may find really willing partners, or you may need to do your own organizing and find that, you know, you have artists on your staff already, or you have artists in your network already that may not have self-identified yet, or who may not have seen their artistic practice or their creative work as part of the work that they've been doing with you. And that might be the easier, more logical, more values aligned place to start, or thinking about how you work. You know, a lot of our work has started by working with neighborhood organizers who often know the quilt maker or the sign painter or the person in the neighborhood who is using their creative skills as an economic driver, or to support other actions and activities that are happening at a neighborhood scale already. So sometimes starting from a more organizing lens is a more effective strategy. That being said, I'm not quite ready to write off those big cultural institutions yet, mostly because they hold so much power and capital, and I feel like we have to keep pressing them to make that change. I would say same with your sort of public officials and city governments. Our approach with a lot of public officials, especially elected officials, has been a show, don't tell, or show, don't ask approach. And a lot of those people have engaged in the work and been supportive of the work after we've started it. That big project I talked about along the light rail, obviously a huge publicly funded federal, state money was in that project. But we started that work alongside the construction project. It wasn't funded by any public money. And it was only after we sort of demonstrated the power of that approach to really do the kind of organizing and relationship building, that then there were more public officials and kind of more participation from that sector, which also kind of links into the conversation we were having earlier about how you sort of make sure the values stay intact in the work.
Yeah, and yes, and yes. So I will add to that, part of what we did with the Delta Creative Business Challenge, we actually utilized the Crossroads Cultural Arts Center to actually host our weekly trainings and workshops with the artists and creative entrepreneurs. And then in the video that I showed earlier, we actually hosted the community kind of pitch competition there as well. So not only did the participants get a chance to come into that space and understand the value and the assets that particular cultural arts center provides, but then the communities, particularly some people that have never, been into that space, we activated that space on that particular day to really engage community, but also lifting up this unique partnership that we have with the Crossroads Cultural Arts Center. And not to repeat what Laura said, but I think there is a unique opportunity for local organizations, grassroots organizations, to start to build the solutions that are needed in our communities. And I'm not opposed to working in collaboration where the values and the morals align. I think we have to make sure that the change that we're creating in our community live beyond a political cycle, live beyond administration, and ensure that the community, the people in those communities that we seek to serve and work with, actually have the capacity and resources and build in this level of sustainability to ensure that change continues. And if larger cultural institutions want to be a part of that, great. If not, great. And we continue to really create what's needed for our community. So that's my personal opinion about that. Yep.
I noticed there was also a question about artist co-ops in the chat, and I don't have all the information about that, but I wanted to kind of address, like, historically, I think artists have been organized into co-ops primarily around housing. So there's a nonprofit developer called ArtSpace that does a lot of development of artist housing originally, some of those were organized as co-ops. Now they're mostly organized as affordable housing rental projects. They have projects all over the country. A lot of sort of retrofit of former warehouses and now quite a bit of new construction. So that's the primary way. I think it's been historically harder for artists to organize into the kinds of co-ops that we see in the like local food or agriculture sector because artists don't make aggregatable products. You know, you can't. It's not like milk where mostly the milk is the same milk. If everyone's making different milk, it's harder to all combine your efforts. But I do think there's some work around that I think is super interesting, and it's part of why I've been so excited to be a part of BALLE and other new economy groups, is that I feel like there's a lot that artists and those of us that work to support artists can learn from the cooperative movements and models that exist. And then the question was also about artist-owned businesses. And I think, you know, in terms of artist-owned businesses that inspire me, there are some really big examples right now, like Meow Wolf in Santa Fe, that, you know, are artist-run businesses that have just sort of exploded in terms of their popularity and particularly because they create experiences that people are interested in. But for me, I'm most inspired by people who are kind of creating really locally focused businesses that come from existing cultures and traditions in their community and finding new ways to sell those products. You know, where my parents are from in the Upper Peninsula, there's a woman who, just like a lot of other women in rural Midwest, raises sheep and spins yarn and makes beautiful products from that. And I feel like that is a local business. It's a historic local business. It's not the sort of shiny new penny of how we think about local experiences, but it's absolutely connected to culture and creativity and experience and social connection, and also creates economic opportunity in places where that's a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I know we have a few minutes left here, so I'll just say, you know, part of what we're able to do, and I think it goes back to something that Laura said earlier, like, you know, really expanding the definition of artist, particularly for our place, and trying to localize that as much as possible, because there is the spirit of creativity that comes from the soil here in the Mississippi Delta where we're based, and so that's embedded into who we are as individuals, and I think for us as an organization is one, providing the platform for that creativity to continue to grow and expand, but also understanding that there are some local needs. And so how can artists and creative entrepreneurs start businesses that not only are creative, that really speak to their level of their gifts, but also address a local challenge, a local need in the community. And so there are a few examples that we're working on, particularly around the cooperative model that we're exploring and thinking about that include artists. And there are a few artist-led businesses that are popping up that provide a very localized and a very true, authentic experience by living and being from the Mississippi Delta. So one of the businesses is called Real Delta. You know, it's one of the few Black-owned tourism tour companies, rather, that's in the Delta that actually provides not the part of the story that's about the beautiful antebellum homes, but also really getting into some of the nuances of the mixed bag of history that comes from a place like Mississippi. And so we believe that by supporting those kinds of businesses, as well as you know, the broader entrepreneurship landscape, that you'll start to see a shift in not only how communities see themselves, but also how local economies are formed and shaped to include everyone.
Awesome. Thank you to both of you. I do want to say it's just about time now, noon here in California. And really want to say super thanks to Laura and Tim. This was some great conversation here. We will be sending out to all the panelists the materials for the slides and a recording of this video, as well as some of the links. We'll kind of collect all the resource links that were mentioned and entered into the chat box, and get those out to folks as well. But thank you so much. This was a great session, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Because artists don't make aggregatable products, you know, you can't, it's not like milk where mostly the milk is the same milk. If everyone's making different milk, it's harder to all combine your efforts. But I do think there's some work around that I think is super interesting, and it's part of why I've been so excited to be a part of BALLE and other new economy groups, is that I feel like there's a lot that artists and those of us that work to support artists can learn from the cooperative movements and models that exist. And then the question was also about artist-owned businesses. And I think, you know, in terms of artist-owned businesses that inspire me, there are some really big examples right now, like Meow Wolf in Santa Fe, that, you know, are artist-run businesses that have just sort of exploded in terms of their popularity, and particularly because they create experiences that people are interested in. But for me, I'm most inspired by people who are kind of creating really locally focused businesses that come from existing cultures and traditions in their community, and finding new ways to sell those products. You know, where my parents are from in the Upper Peninsula, there's a woman who, just like a lot of other women in rural Midwest, raises sheep and spins yarn and makes beautiful products from that. And I feel like that is a local business. It's a historic local business. It's not the sort of shiny new penny of how we think about local experiences, but it's absolutely connected to culture and creativity and experience and social connection, and also creates economic opportunity in places where that's a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I know we have a few minutes left here, so I'll just say, you know, part of what we're able to do, and I think it goes back to something that Laura said earlier, like, you know, really expanding the definition of artist, particularly for our place, and trying to localize that as much as possible, because there is the spirit of creativity that comes from the soil here in the Mississippi Delta where we're based. And so that's embedded into who we are as individuals. And I think for us as an organization is, one, providing the platform for that creativity to continue to grow and expand, but also understanding that there are some local needs. And so how can artists and creative entrepreneurs start businesses that not only are creative, that really speak to their level of their gifts, but also address a local challenge, a local need in the community. And so there are a few examples that we're working on, particularly around the cooperative model that we're exploring and thinking about, that include artists. And there are a few artist-led businesses that are popping up that provide a very localized and a very true, authentic experience by living and being from the Mississippi Delta. So one of the businesses is called Real Delta. You know, it's one of the few Black-owned tourism tour companies, rather, that's in the Delta, that actually provides not the part of the story that's about the beautiful antebellum homes, but also really getting into some of the nuances of the mixed bag of history that comes from a place like Mississippi. And so we believe that by supporting those kinds of businesses, as well as the broader entrepreneurship landscape, that you'll start to see a shift in not only how communities see themselves, but also how local economies are formed and shaped to include everyone.
Awesome. Thank you to both of you. I do want to say it's just about time now, noon here in California, and really want to say super thanks to Laura and Tim. This was some great conversation here. We will be sending out to all the panelists the materials for the slides and a recording of this video, as well as some of the links. We'll kind of collect all the resource links that were mentioned and entered into the chat box, and get those out to folks as well. But thank you so much. This was a great session. And thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.